In this season of Lent, we've been making our way through the 7 deadly sins. Now, you're not going to find them listed in the Old Testament like we have the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus, nor will you find them listed in the New Testament like the fruit of the Spirit, where there are 9 virtues that are listed one after the other, or character traits that we should embrace. However, you will find the story after story, and evidence of the destructive nature of these sins and these common human struggles throughout the Scriptures. And it all explains why we have a need for Jesus. The list of 7 was first introduced in early Christian monastic tradition in the 4th century by Evagrius Ponticus. His list actually included 8 vices, but 2 are so closely related, they've been merged together when we think about pride. It's not pride and vainglory, but pride. And then in the 6th century, Pope Gregory modified the list, adding envy, which we talked about last week, and taking away sadness from that list. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century further added to the theological development of this list by revealing that these sins were considered deadly not because they were the worst of sins, but that each of these sins and emotions could bring out or give birth to, produce any number of sins. I find this deadly qualifier especially helpful when we consider anger. Anger in and of itself is not sin. So maybe I've got the title of the sermon wrong today. In our lesson, Paul states, "Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger." Any anger we have can lead to sins that need to be avoided. In other words, we are to do something with this anger. Don't suppress it, don't deny it, but it's not the best advice to let it all out, though we may have been encouraged to do that. I don't know about you, but I tend to be at my worst when I'm angry. Even if for a moment of acute madness, I'm not acting or thinking like myself. And so any anger needs to then be managed well. We're familiar with the phrase and the need to manage one's anger and their anger management classes in therapy. When it comes to anger, there are times when there's a need to, like I talked to the children, to push pause and to seek to de-escalate the situation so as to let anger out eventually in constructive ways and not harmful ways, not destructive ways. Yes, we can be at our worst when we are angry, but sometimes we can be very productive in our anger. Martin Luther wrote, "I never work better than when I am inspired by anger. For when I'm angry, I can write, pray, and preach well. For then my whole temperature is quickened, my understanding sharpened, and all my mundane and vexations and temptations depart." There's no sin in simply being angry. There's no sin in being angry with God or with another person or over circumstances that are beyond our control. See, if you never get angry about anything or at anyone, are you actually living? And do you actually care? But when we're angry, what we do with such anger can be helpful or it can be hurtful and sinful. Perhaps some have been led to believe that we are to never give anger to God or to be angry with God and never question God. And yet, as we read the psalmists, what do we see? Yes, they're wonderful, beautiful psalms that speak about God's abiding presence and how God sustains us. But there are also some psalms like Psalm 13, 22, 44, 137, just to name a few, where the psalmist isn't happy. And the object of the anger is directed where? To God. And the way I look at it, if the psalmist could write these words and they are considered sacred canon, then it suggests that God is big enough and good enough to receive our anger today. It's helpful to give anger to God. After all, what do we hear Paul write in the book of Romans? Vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. And Paul continues to write, do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. When anger meets anger, it usually doesn't end well. And it prolongs the potential for peace, the potential for healing, and the opportunity for forgiveness. Expressing anger to God can be a healthy way of dealing with many of life's circumstances. And there are times when anger is the emotion we need to give to God in prayer. See, I don't always want to be the one who receives the brunt of anger from church members, but I do hope that within the church, we can come before God as we worship with such an emotion. Far better to come to God when we are at our worst and to receive a peace that surpasses understanding, to experience that healing balm of Gilead, or to find our calm, than when we are at our worst and doing something like lashing out or some other destructive and hurtful behavior. Not just hurtful to an individual, but to families and to communities, if not to nations. Anger is an emotion. It is a God-given emotion that needs to be expressed, and hopefully in helpful and constructive ways. And so how we express it or suppress it, or how it boils up in our lives, that's when anger can lead to bitterness and resentment and destruction, isolation, harm, brokenness, and any number of irrational thoughts and behaviors. See, anger is not sinful in the same way that temptation is not sinful, though we should not play around with temptation. Nor should we let anger linger. We are human and we are bound to get angry at times. We can express anger in ways that is channeled to do something good, or we can let anger get the best of us and we end up doing something out of character and irrational in a moment of madness, and then we have to deal with the harmful effects afterwards. On Wednesday morning, I listened to Bishop Easterling preach at a Faithful Resistance worship service, and her message was passionately delivered. Or some might say she was on fire. And she was. Another person might say or characterize her as angry. As I sat there and listened to her sermon, there was more than just a little righteous indignation. As Christians, don't we want our leaders and staff members to be passionate about their faith and passionate about the love of Christ that we're to share? Don't we want that for them, our leaders? But also, don't we want that for ourselves? To be passionate about our faith and in living out as disciples of Jesus Christ, who calls us to follow in His ways? You know, as we read about Jesus, He was most certainly passionate about seeking to transform not just society or transform the church or the synagogue but yet to transform the world. And He passionately challenged the status quo and religious understanding. When Jesus went into the temple and saw activity that simply did not belong there, as it was keeping people away from having access to God in worship, Jesus didn't calmly go in and move a few chairs and tables aside, saying, pardon me, excuse me, but I'm sorry. I really am sorry. I just have to move these things over to the side for people to have access to God. You don't read that, though many times we want that of Jesus. No, he went into the temple and he saw what was going on, and in a fit of anger, in a burst of righteous indignation, he flipped over the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves, and he proclaimed, not in a church voice, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. His passionate act of righteous indignation did a great deal of good and not harm. But what was the response? The response, however, from the religious elites who were comfortable in the way things were angry enough to want him to be crucified. Interesting, in the story of Jesus showing righteous indignation, anger, and the religious leaders being angry enough to want to kill, we see the importance not only of expressing anger in ways that is helpful, but also makes me want to ask, are we today angry or righteously indignant over the right things? We tend to get angry enough to leave a church over the change of the color of the carpet. Did that happen here, friends? Or we get angry enough when the church changes the worship times and want to leave, or when others are extended the same grace that we received, or when a pastor actually preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ instead of offering the Republican Jesus gospel or the Democratic Jesus gospel or the Star-Spangled Jesus. When we should be getting angry over apathy and injustice. Christians who are not living the way of Jesus, the way of the cross, the way of discipleship, and when the church has become too complicit, too comfortable, and too silent in the face of oppression, or racism, or anti-Semitism, or xenophobia, or sexism, or fill in any of the others. See, if we're not passionate, we can experience apathy and detachment, something you'll likely hear from Jackson next week as he preaches on the sin of sloth, unless Jackson wants to express the sin of sloth by not writing a sermon. Then good luck next Sunday. And I can tell you he's going to be passionate about preaching on the sin of sloth. See, we can do a great deal in this community of faith and in the world when we are passionately living out our faith, when we are actually doing something instead of living detached from the cries of others or the needs of others, detached from any number of injustices in the world today. Bishop Will Willimon writes, anger is a natural, necessary response in the face of injustice. It is an acknowledgement that this is not the world as it was meant to be, not the world as God intended. The anger should be expressed preferably in church, in prayer, in conversation with God. We have a God who's good enough and great enough to receive our anger, to take even the most raw human emotions and weave them into His purposes. Anger can be expressed, but ought not to be acted upon without the greatest of care. There's a saying often attributed to John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, but there's no actual evidence that he actually said this quote. But the quote seems to be around as long as Methodism has been around. It wasn't recorded in any of his works or a journal or a sermon. But it does speak to the fire which should burn within. And this is the quote: Light yourself on fire with passion, and people will come from miles to watch you burn. And what does that signify? It signifies enthusiasm and faith, or dedication is contagious and will naturally attract others to witness your purpose-driven life. The church today needs to take such passion and anger and use it in constructive ways instead of suppressing it or not expressing it for fear it may upset a few who are fine being comfortable with the status quo. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if any anger we felt was always expressed as righteous indignation? Or any other anger was expressed and the outcome was always building up and always beneficial and always helpful? Finding that balance of knowing how to use anger for good and how to manage it, how to control it, and then when it controls us and becomes destructive, that's not easy. This emotion needs to come with a warning. Handle with care, handle with prayer. Aristotle said anybody can become angry. That's the easy part. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power. And it's not easy. This season of Lent is to be a season of learning, a season of trying, a season of testing, a season of letting go, a season of reflection, and naming that which doesn't belong in our lives. Lent is like the church's version or the Christian's version of spring training for baseball. It really is. To get ready for another season, to get ready for Easter, to get ready to welcome Jesus. And so as we look at anger, are there relationships that need to be restored due to the brokenness and the harm done by anger? See, just as anger is a choice, we do get to choose how we express it. Just as anger is a choice, so is forgiveness. So who might God in the season of Lent, who might God be calling you to forgive? Do we need to practice some cooling down? Employing tactics to better manage an impulsive anger that can get the best of us and bring out the worst in us? Do you have any suppressed anger that needs a healthy outlet as the sun continually has set on your anger day after day for months on end? Martin Luther defined sin as the heart all curved in on itself. A heart all curved in on itself. Has anger turned inward, building up resentment and bitterness, and the result is isolation, even when we're supposed to be in community. In the season of Lent, new beginnings and healing can come as we give this to God. When we ask for forgiveness and forgive others, when we reflect on the grace given to us, and when we find ourselves in a community that is shaped by the cross of Jesus. On the cross, when humans were at our worst, God did not lash out in anger, but rather God was bringing forth redemption of the world God so loves. Speaking, Jesus did, words of what? Not anger in that moment, but he had the audacity to speak a word of forgiveness. And in the act of the suffering, death, and resurrection, God is releasing us from the powers of sin and death and enabling us to live free from that which so easily binds us. We are at our best when we accept this freedom that God has given us and we share in a community that is shaped by the love of God and the grace of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.